Maybe you've felt it, modern bread leaving you feeling bloated. But change the grain, and sometimes that changes. Some who deal with this say spelt sits better. Nearly 3,000 years ago, Scripture records the seventh plague tearing across Egypt. Thunder, fire, and hail, judgment on a nation that refused to free God's people. Yet spelt survived. Even in judgment, God had made provision. So, what makes this ancient grain different? Research has found measurable differences between spelt and modern wheat that might explain why. Before this is over, I'll show you how to choose it, mill it, and bake it into a spelt sourdough loaf. Because a grain like this belongs in your pantry, ready before you know what's coming. But first, we go back to Egypt. By the time Moses stood before Pharaoh again, Egypt had already endured 6 plagues. The 7th came with a warning. At this time tomorrow, hail would fall with a violence Egypt had never known. Anything left outside, including servants and livestock, would be struck down. Bring them in, get them under shelter, now. The warning wasn't only for Pharaoh. Some officials feared the word of the Lord and hurried their people and livestock under shelter. Others didn't heed it. Then morning came, and the sky broke open. Thunder rolls, fire flashes through the storm. Then the hail comes, exactly as promised. Out in the fields, there's nowhere to hide. Trees splinter, crops standing the day before are hammered down. Pharaoh summons Moses and says, for the first time, plainly, I have sinned. Moses prays. The thunder stops. The hail stops. Those who had sheltered came through untouched. Isaiah 43:2. When you walk through fire, you shall not be burned, and only then can anyone see what is left. The barley and flax are destroyed, but 2 crops remain, wheat and the ancient grain we know as spelt. They didn't survive because they were stronger. If anything, it was the opposite. The barley stood tall, its heads already formed. The flax was in bloom. Wheat and spelt were slower to harvest. They weren't yet tall enough for the hail to damage. The crops that weren't ready were the crops still standing. In the days after, people walked into flattened fields, wheat and spelt gathered by hand, stalk by stalk, out of the ruin. But there was still more to be done. The wheat gave up its grain easily enough. The spelt didn't. Its kernel stayed locked inside a tough hull, and someone had to work it free, by hand, before any of it could become bread. That problem never really went away. Spelt still demands extra work before it reaches your pantry today. And somehow, despite that, the grain left standing after one of Egypt's plagues held on for thousands of years, until it began disappearing from our fields. Not because we discovered something wrong with it, because we discovered something easier, and those two aren't the same thing. So, did we leave something better behind? For some people, the first difference isn't something you can see, it's something you feel. Modern wheat can leave them bloated. Some of those same people say spelt sits more easily. And there are measurable differences that might help explain why. One involves fructans, carbohydrates that aren't fully absorbed in the small intestine. Gut bacteria ferment them instead, which can cause gas and bloating in sensitive people. Across a wide range of wheat varieties, spelt consistently comes in lower for fructans than modern wheat. Other studies have found higher levels of minerals like iron, zinc, and magnesium in spelt. But the grain itself is only part of the story. It was also how people made the bread. For much of history, bread wasn't fast. Fermented dough was already familiar in biblical times, familiar enough that in Matthew 13:33, Jesus compared the kingdom of heaven to leaven worked through flour until it was all leavened, something small working quietly, transforming the whole batch from within. That's not a bad description of what's happening in a bowl of fermenting dough. Given enough time, microorganisms break down some of those fructans and reduce phytic acid, a compound that binds minerals like iron and zinc, making them harder for your body to absorb. Spelt itself brings real differences. Fermentation, given time, adds another layer on top. Before spelt could reach the mill, there was still the problem we've followed from the beginning. That hull. It's not the bran we associate with whole grain. It's an inedible covering that has to come off before milling. Underneath, the bran, germ, and endosperm remain intact. And that's what actually matters. Refine a grain, and you strip away the bran and germ, along with most of the fiber, minerals, and healthy fats they carry. Keep all three, and you keep the grain's actual nutrition, not just its name. For centuries, people accepted the extra work. In one German region, records from 1850 show Spelt covering 94% of land used to grow grain. Wheat barely registered at 5%. Then, in the early 20th century, a machine came along. The combine harvester could cut, thresh, and clean modern wheat in a single pass. Spelt's kernel, however, remained sealed inside its hull and needed another step before milling. Mechanization turned that into a disadvantage. Farmers turned toward wheat that yielded more and moved more efficiently through the new system. Within decades, Spelt had retreated to a handful of valleys in Germany and Switzerland, but nobody had discovered Spelt was worse to eat. Agriculture was solving a different problem: higher yields, easier processing, predictable performance, real improvements. But they never answered the question we started with: what about the person eating it? That's where Spelt's story gets interesting again. The lower fructans, the minerals, what fermentation can do when given time. None of that disappeared. It just wasn't what the new system was selecting for. But if you're willing to accept that extra step today, there's another reason to keep Spelt around. It doesn't have to be stored as flour. Spelt can wait for you. That takes us back to those fields in Egypt. The value of food isn't only what it gives you today. Sometimes it's that it can still be there when tomorrow doesn't go as planned. So that's where we're going next. How to choose whole Spelt, store it, and turn it into fresh flour when you need it. So, you've decided Spelt is worth the trouble. Now, let's take it from a whole kernel to flour. And here's the first thing to know. Most of the hard work has already been done for you. Remember that hull we've been talking about? The tough covering that made Spelt so inconvenient historically? Don't put that through your mill. What you're looking for are dehulled whole Spelt berries. The outer hull has already been removed, but the edible kernel is still intact. Bran, germ, and endosperm together. And that's exactly how you want to store it. Whole berries keep remarkably well when they're cool, dry, and airtight. But once you mill them, you break that kernel open and expose the oils in the germ to air. So keep Spelt as berries. Mill the flour when you need it. And until surprisingly recently, that was simply how everyone did it. In biblical times, flour didn't begin in a bag. Grain was stored whole, then ground as it was needed. In ordinary households, that could mean a small stone hand mill, two stones working against each other, crushing the kernels into flour. It was daily work. Over time, people found ways to make the grinding easier. Animals like donkeys or oxen were harnessed to turn larger millstones. Later, mills were built to run on flowing water, and eventually on wind. For centuries, communities brought whole grain to local millers and carried flour home. Only relatively recently did most of us stop seeing the grain before we saw the flour. And that's what a home mill gives back, without the hours of work. Before you start, spread your Spelt berries out and give them a quick look. Make sure they're clean and remove any stones or debris. One stray stone can be very bad news for a grain mill. For bread, you want a fine grind. If your mill is adjustable, move toward its fine flour setting. Home mills come in a few basic types. Stone burr mills use two heavy discs, called burrs, that the grain passes between as it's ground. Essentially the same principle as that ancient hand mill, just powered by a motor instead. Steel burr mills work the same way, but use metal discs instead of stone, which grind faster. Impact mills work differently. Instead of crushing the grain between two surfaces, a fast spinning wheel smashes it apart. Both metal options tend to generate more heat than stone as they work. There's also a manual option, hand crank mills, which use the same stone or steel mechanism, just turned by hand instead of powered by a motor. If you're buying a mill, just make sure it's built for dry grain, not a wet grinder made for soaked rice or lentils, and not a coffee or spice grinder. Whole Spelt berries go in. Fresh flour comes out, warm, fragrant, slightly nutty. And if you've only ever opened bags of flour, there's something strangely satisfying about watching this happen. Nothing has been sifted away. The bran is there, the germ is there, the starchy endosperm is there. There are only a few rules I want you to remember. First, mill only what you're going to use. The rest stays whole, the way we just covered. Second, Keep it fine for this loaf. Spelt can also be cracked or ground coarsely for a hot porridge, or left whole and cooked like rice as a side dish. But for the bread we're about to make, we want fine whole grain flour. Third, don't assume everything in your pantry belongs in your mill. Nuts and oily seeds can clog mills that aren't designed for them, so always check your machine's instructions before experimenting. For thousands of years, freeing this grain from its hull demanded real physical labor. That part is already done before it ever reaches you. What's left is milling, and now it's entirely your choice how much of that work you want to do yourself. Either way, the real trick is knowing what not to do once it becomes dough. Now, we make the bread. One quick reminder, spelt still isn't recommended for people with gluten sensitivity, even though some studies suggest it may have less gluten than modern wheat bread. Before you start, check that your starter is active, fed a few hours ahead, roughly doubled in size, visibly bubbly. If it's still flat, feed it again and wait. A weak starter means a weak rise no matter how long the dough sits. You'll need 530 grams of whole grain spelt flour, 350 grams of water, 75 grams of active sourdough starter, 63 grams of honey, and 10 grams of salt, roughly 5 cups of flour, a cup and a half of water, a quarter cup of starter, 3 tablespoons of honey, and a teaspoon and a half of salt. Use the gram measurements if you have a scale. Bread is more forgiving when the ratios are right. Start by whisking the water, starter, and honey together in a large bowl. Add the spelt flour and salt, then mix until no dry flour remains. The dough will look wet and shaggy. That's exactly what you want. The higher moisture gives the loaf its open crumb and larger holes. Don't knead it. Spelt's gluten is too delicate for that. Instead, cover the bowl and let the dough rest for 30 minutes. Wet your hand, reach underneath one side of the dough, stretch it upward, and fold it over the center. Turn the bowl a quarter turn and repeat until all 4 sides are folded. That's one set. Wait 15 to 30 minutes and repeat. 4 sets total. After the final set, cover the bowl and let it rise 6 to 12 hours. Warmer kitchens land toward the shorter end, cooler ones take longer. Watch the dough more than the clock. You're looking for bubbles across the surface and dough that's clearly grown, not necessarily doubled, but noticeably bigger and lighter than when you started. Once the first rise is finished, turn the dough out onto a lightly floured surface. Fold the sides up and in, pinching the top together. This pulls it into a tight ball and seals the seam underneath. Wet dough like this will stick to a proofing basket unless you line it first. Parchment paper works fine. Place the dough in seam side up, so it lands on the bottom once you flip it out to bake. Let it rise again about an hour to 90 minutes. Press a floured finger gently into the surface to check. If it springs back slowly and partway, it's ready. If it springs back fast and fully, wait longer. If you'd rather bake in the morning, let it rise at room temperature 30 to 60 minutes. Then refrigerate several hours or overnight. Preheat your oven and a covered baking vessel to 450 degrees Fahrenheit or 230 degrees Celsius for 30 minutes before baking. A Dutch oven works well, so does a narrower oblong dish, which helps a wet dough like this rise up instead of spreading flat. When you're ready to bake, gently turn the dough out of the basket and into the hot vessel. Scoring the top with a sharp knife is optional. A dough this wet often cracks open beautifully on its own. Put the lid on. Bake 35 minutes covered, then 10 more uncovered. You want a deeply browned crust, and if you have a thermometer, a center temperature around 195 to 200 degrees Fahrenheit, or 90 to 93 degrees Celsius. Then comes the hardest step. Leave it alone. Cool the loaf on a wire rack for at least an hour before cutting. The inside is still setting, and slicing too soon leaves the crumb gummy. If your first loaf isn't perfect, don't assume you did something wrong. Dense usually means the rise needed longer. Too much spread usually means it fermented too far or was handled too roughly. That's the lesson of spelt. Don't force it to behave like modern wheat. Give it gentle folds, give it time, and learn what the dough is telling you. Cut through the dark crust and you'll find a close, tender crumb with the sweet, nutty flavor that kept people doing this extra work for centuries. Was it worth the trouble? Taste it, then decide for yourself. Nearly 3,000 years ago, Spelt stood in an Egyptian field after the hail had passed. It survived because it wasn't ready when everything else was. Eventually, we found easier wheat, and Spelt faded from our fields. But easier was never the same as better. You've milled the grain, you've felt the dough behave differently. Scripture gives us two images: provision still standing after the storm, and leaven quietly transforming the dough. One reminds us that something can remain when all seems lost. The other, that change can be happening before we ever see it. 3,000 years later, this ancient grain carries both lessons into our kitchen.